Hello everybody and welcome back to BeginnerJS. I'm Abrar and I'm the creator and instructor of this course. And in this video, we're going to be diving into the world of objects. Now, almost everything in JavaScript is an object, and thus objects are used extensively throughout the language. So let's learn more about it. Okay, so we're talking about objects. So what exactly are objects and how are they used inside the language? Well, objects are used to store related data and functionality together. That is the main job of objects. Now here's one thing. There are a lot of ways of using objects in JavaScript, and they have their different purposes. There are a lot of ways of creating objects in JavaScript as well. However, for this video, we're going to be focusing on using objects to store related data and functionality together. But do note that objects are used in a lot of other ways in JavaScript. For example, they can be created from constructor functions or be instantiated from classes as well. And these constructor functions and classes can be used together with concepts such as the prototype chain, object inheritance, and object-oriented programming to create a lot more complex applications. But those are actually very advanced uses of objects, so we won't talk about all these in this mini course. Those are advanced level JavaScript and they are out of the scope of this course. However, in this video, we are going to be looking at the basics of objects. And here, we will use the most basic way of creating and manipulating objects, and that is by using the object literal. Now, when talking about object literal specifically, one of the most common uses of these objects are to store related data and functionality together. So in this sense, they work a lot like arrays. So arrays in JavaScript can be used to store data together. So for example, if you have multiple pieces of data that are related to one another, instead of storing them separately, you can use an array to store all of them side by side as a list inside one single variable. So objects can be used in a very similar way as well to store data, but there are two main distinctions. First of all, each value inside an object or piece of data can get its own name, which is called a property of that object. And the second distinction is that objects can not only contain simple data or values, but it can also contain functions themselves. So object properties can have functions as their values. And if that happens, you can use that function as a method of that object. And thus you can have related data and functionality together inside your object. Now in more advanced applications, objects can be used to model real-world objects inside the application. So for example, if we have a note-taking application where the user can create, edit, and delete notes, then in order to represent a note inside the application, we might create a note object, which will contain related data and functionality. For example, the data that note might store might be the title or the description of that note. And that note object can have different functionalities, such as updating its values or deleting it altogether. So do note that in more advanced applications, objects can be used to model real-world objects inside applications. And this programming paradigm is often known as OOP, or Object-Oriented Programming. Also note that almost everything in JavaScript is actually an object. Even literal values in JavaScript such as string literals, number literals, or boolean literals, which are not really created as objects, even they can have properties and methods available. And that is because when you create a literal in JavaScript, JavaScript internally wraps that literal around in its related object, and thus the literal value can have access to the object's properties and methods as well. So for now, just know that almost everything in JavaScript is an object. Okay, so now that we've learned what objects are and how they are used, now let's actually create an object and write the code for it. In this case, we'll start off with a variable. We want to store our object inside a variable so we can reference it later on and manipulate it and use it in different ways. In this case, the object will model a fruit. So let's model a fruit object inside our application. So we'll create a variable called fruit. So we type in var fruit equals and then the object. So we have a variable called fruit, and this fruit variable will contain our fruit object. Now in this case, we'll use an object literal syntax to create the object. And for object literals, all the properties and methods go inside a pair of curly braces. So this is very similar to code blocks. Just like code blocks start and end with curly braces, similarly, all the properties and methods, meaning data and functionality, stored inside the object, which we'll define in the object's body, are stored inside a pair of curly braces. So you put in a pair of curly braces, and in between them, you define all the properties and methods of that object. So in this case, we'll start off with the first curly brace, and at the very last line, we'll have our ending curly brace. So that's why we type in var fruit equals a curly brace. And now in the next lines, we will define our properties and methods. Let's see how that works. Okay, so in this case, we have our first property and the value of that property. The property name is name and the value is the string apple. So in this case, you type in name and then a colon and then the value, which in this case is a string apple, and then a comma at the end of the line. So what exactly is going on here? So inside objects here, just like arrays, you can define multiple values. Inside arrays, you just write the values side by side and separate them by a comma. But in objects, it's a bit different. Inside objects, you have the option to define a specific property name for each value. So for example, in this case, the first value in the list is apple. Now if this were an array, we could just type in the string apple and then comma and then put all the other values side by side. However, for objects, we have the option to define a property name and attach that property name to the specific value. So in this case, the first value or the string apple can be assigned a property name. In this case, the property name is simply name, which refers to the name of the fruit. So in this case, we have a fruit object with a property named name, which has the value the string apple. Now in the next line, we have another property. In this case, the property name is color. So the color property has a value the string red. So we type in color and then a colon and then a string red and finally a comma so we can add more values later on. So as you can see, there's a pattern here. Inside objects, you can define property names and their values using the key value pairs. So you type in the property name and then a colon and then a space and then the value. And that is how you define properties and values inside the object. So if you have a property named color and then a value with the string red, you can just type in color and then a colon and then the value, in this case the string red. And that is how you can define different properties inside the object. So first we have a name property with the value apple, and then we have a property color with the value red. Now let's define our third property. Okay, so the third property in this case will be weight. So a fruit is an object, right? And an object has a weight. So let's save that value as a property inside our object. So we'll define a property named weight, and it'll have the value the number 182. And it'll have the value the number 182, referring to 182 grams, which is the average weight of an apple. So here, as you can see, property values can be almost anything. They're not limited to strings or numbers. They can also be booleans, arrays, and even functions, as we'll see in just a minute. So in order to create this property, we again follow the simple syntax. We type in the property name, then a colon, and then the value. So weight, colon, and then 182, and then a comma so we can add another property below. Okay, so here let's add our fourth and last property. In this case, the property name will be description. So we type in description, and then a colon, and then we need to type in the value of the property, right? In this case, instead of having a simple value, we have a whole function as a value of this property. Now when you have a function as a value of a property, then that property can be called a method. So that function and property automatically becomes a method of that object. So whenever we have a property with a value that is a function, we call that property a method. So in this case, the description property is actually a method of the fruit object. So we have created a method called description for the fruit object. Now inside the description property, we have a value which is an object. So we type in description and then a colon and then the value. In this case, the value is the function itself, so we just type in function and then a pair of parentheses, and then we start the function's code block with the starting curly brace. Now one thing you'll notice here is that this function doesn't have a name. Usually in order to declare a function, you first type in the function keyword and then a name and then a pair of parentheses, and then we start the code block or the function's body. However, in this case, we don't need a name for this function. This is called an anonymous function because these types of functions doesn't have a name. So you skip the name part and just directly type in function and then a pair of parentheses. And then get started on the code block or the function's body. Now because we're defining this function as a value of the property description, the name of the property can be used as the name of the function when executing it. So you don't need to define a different function name inside the function's value itself. Okay, so after we declare the function, let's go right into the function's body. So what exactly we will have inside the function's body? In this case, we have a return statement. So when the description method will be called and this function will be executed, we will return a specific value. What value will be returned? Well, in this case, the value will be this.name plus the string is plus this.color. So what exactly is this? Now this is a special keyword in JavaScript. And the keyword called this always refers to the current object that the code is in. So you can think of the keyword this as being a reference and pointing to the object scope the code is in. So if you type in the this keyword normally, that would point to the global object. For example, inside a browser, the global object is a window object. However, when you use the this keyword inside an object, for example, like we're doing here, then the this keyword refers to the current object, which means the fruit object itself. And this.name refers to the current object's name property. So the current object is the fruit object, and fruit object.name means the name property of the fruit object. And thus, this.name refers to the name property of the fruit object, which has the value the string apple. So this.name is basically the string apple. And similarly, this.color is basically the string red, because this.color means the color property of the fruit object, which is the value the string red. So this expression basically evaluates the string apple concatenated with the string is concatenated with the string red. So apple is red. That is basically the string that we're trying to create here. And finally, we have a semicolon to end the statement. And on the next line, we have the ending curly brace for the function itself. So this actually completes the description property, where with the property name, description, and then a colon, and then the whole function, and inside the function's body, we create a string concatenating the name with the color, and then return that inside the function. And lastly, we have the ending curly brace for the function itself. So the very first line, we had var fruit equals the starting curly brace, and now we have the ending curly brace and then a semicolon to completely wrap up and finish off the object itself. And that is how you can use the object literal to create an object in JavaScript. So here we have created an object and saved it inside a variable called fruit. This object has three properties: name, color, and weight, and another property which actually contains a function as a value, and thus it's a method. So we have a name property, the color property, and the weight property with the values apple, red, and 182 respectively. And finally, a description method which has a function which will return a value describing the fruit object itself. So this is our whole fruit object. Now how do we exactly use it? How can we retrieve and modify the values? Let's find out. Okay, so now let's take a look at exactly how you can use such an object. In order to start, we will define our fruit object again. So we had a fruit object in the previous slide, so we'll just have the same fruit object here as well, so we can work with this object and use it in more detail. Now in this case, inside the slide, we're not showing all the properties and methods inside the object itself, because that would take up a lot of screen space. So we just type in var fruit equals curly braces and ... inside the pair of curly braces. However, in real life code, you would obviously need to write down all the properties and methods inside the object itself. So we'll just define the object first and save it in a variable called fruit, like we did in the previous slide. Now that we have the object inside the variable, we can use that object inside JavaScript. Let's see how that works. So in this case, first we type in fruit.name and then a semicolon to end the statement. And as you can see, the result is the output, the string apple. That is how you can retrieve the values of properties inside objects. This is called using the dot notation. Using the dot syntax, we type in the object and then a dot and then the name of the property to retrieve the value of the specific property. So you just type in fruit.name to retrieve the value of the name property. So fruit.name retrieves the string apple because that is the value of the name property. Now here you might notice that this is very similar to all the properties and methods we have seen earlier. For example, you can create a string and type in the string.length, and using the length property, you can tell how long the string is. Fundamentally, that is actually very similar to what we're doing here. Over there, we have a string object, and we're typing in the string.length to access the value of the length property of that specific string object. Here we have an object called fruit, and we're typing in fruit.name to retrieve the value of the name property of the fruit object. And this outputs the string apple, as expected. Similarly, we can type in fruit.description, and remember the description property is actually a method, because the value it contains is a function. So in order to actually execute the method, we need to put in a pair of parentheses at the end. So we type in fruit.description, and then a pair of parentheses to actually execute the method, and then finally a semicolon to end the statement. And as you can see, the result is apple is red, and that is how the description method should work. Inside the description method, we're returning a value, and that value is the name of the fruit, then the string is, and then the color of the fruit. So in this case, the name is apple, the color is red, so the output string is the string apple is red. And that is how you can use the method to describe the object. The description method describes the object for us. And similarly, you can access the value of all the properties and methods defined inside the object. For example, you can type in fruit.weight to get the weight of the object, and fruit.color to get the value of the color property of the fruit object. Now there is another way of accessing the value of a property of an object, and that is using the bracket notation. The bracket notation is actually very similar to how you access the values of an array. So if you have a fruit array, for example, you can just type in fruit and then a pair of square brackets, and inside the pair of square brackets you can type in the index of the specific value, for example 0, 1, 2, and so on. And that will retrieve the value with that specific index. With objects, we don't have automatically assigned indexes. Instead, we have the property names themselves as identifiers for the specific values. So we can type in the property name inside the square brackets as well. So we can just type in fruit and the square brackets and the string weight, referring to the weight property of the fruit object, and that retrieves 182, the number. And that is because the value of the weight property is 182. So this is actually same as typing in fruit.weight. However, using the bracket notation, they can use dynamic property names if you please. Now with an object, you can not only retrieve the values of the different properties, but you can also change them later on as well. In order to do so, you just need to assign a different value to a property. So if you type in fruit.color, you'll get the string red as the value. However, you can just simply assign a different value to that property, and the value of that property will be changed. So you can type in fruit.color equals the string green. And if you do that, the value of this color property will be changed from the string red to the string green. So in this case, fruit.color equals the string green means we're changing the value of the color property from the string red to the string green. And now after this, if you type in fruit.color, you'll get the string green instead of the string red. What's even more exciting is that the description method's output automatically changes based on the property values as well. So previously when we typed in fruit.description and then parentheses, we got the value apple is red as an output. However, now if we type in fruit.description and the parentheses to execute the method, we get the value apple is green, because now the value of the color property has been changed from red to green. And when we call the description method, it dynamically generates the values from this.name and this.color and actually adds all of them up and gives us the string output. So now because we changed the value of the property color, the output of the description method has been updated automatically as well. And now fruit.description and then parentheses gives us the value apple is green. And that is how you can create, modify, and use objects in JavaScript.